Factsverse presents Cop helps man on the streets learn his true identity. Before we get into the video, though, please click that like button and also be sure to subscribe and click the notification bell so you don't miss our future videos. In most cities around the United States, there are people who have no place to call a home. These people live on the streets because they've run out of options. It's a sad reality, however, it is the world that we're living in today. And this man lived on the streets for 30 years, but then a police officer discovered the man's true identity. Mick Myers is one of those unfortunate homeless individuals. For over 30 years, he was living on the streets of East Bay in California. He was 67 years old, and most of his life was spent on the streets. When he was only 2, he was adopted. He grew up in San Leandro, California, and while he was growing up, he was in his school's marching band, and it appeared he had a typical childhood. Unfortunately, he never felt like he belonged. His home life was difficult. Although his adoptive mother showed him love and affection, he never felt like his siblings wanted him there. They had a special bond with one another, and he wasn't part of those bonds. They just didn't have a connection. When Mick's adoptive parents died, the rest of the family turned their backs on him. He didn't have many friends as a kid, and he lost contact with the ones he did have. He found a job as a truck driver, though, and part of the job was isolation. He'd be on the road for days at a time, all alone. In the years that followed, his feelings of isolation grew worse. Eventually, it became too much for him and his truck driving career ended, and that landed him on the streets. Mick lived on the streets for 30 years. He spent his days playing his guitar and panhandling for money. It wasn't an ideal situation, however, it was his life. In November 2017, though, everything changed. Mick would often panhandle near a freeway in Hayward, California. Deputy Sheriff Jacob Swalwell of Alameda County saw Mick often. He'd approach him and tell him that he wasn't allowed to beg on the side of a busy street. He told Mick that it wasn't safe for him and it wasn't safe for the people driving either. Well, after several warnings, Jacob finally decided to give Mick a citation. When he asked Mick for some ID, Mick told him that he didn't have any. When the officer asked him why, Mick said that he wasn't a drug addict and he wasn't an alcoholic. He was just a senior citizen with no ID. Since the man had no identification, Jacob really couldn't give him a citation. And this is when Jacob decided he needed to learn a little bit more about this man. Mick told Jacob that he'd been homeless for 30 years, but unfortunately he didn't qualify for Social Security. He told Jacob that without an ID, he couldn't get the benefits. Jacob decided he needed to help the man. Jacob told Mick that he was going to help him get an ID so that he could get benefits and finally get off the streets. Unfortunately, Jacob found it difficult to get Mick an ID. When Jacob contacted the DMV, he found out that they had wiped out any trace of the man even though he was once a truck driver. If Mick was going to get an ID, he had to meet certain requirements. Jacob found that they were sort of caught in a catch-22 situation. Not only would Mick need to provide his birth certificate, he'd also need to come up with 2 forms of proof of residency to prove that he was a California resident. How can a homeless man come up with proof of residency? Jacob worked to get Mick a copy of his birth certificate, and it was then he learned that the man's real name was Gordon Michael Oakley. The man didn't even know his real name. Next, Jacob got the pastor at a local church to provide proof of residency. When word about Jacob's kind gesture got out, the local news decided to do a segment on them. And this got Mark Askin's attention. He was a private investigator who worked with a nonprofit charity called Miracle Messages. The organization's objective was to reunite homeless people with the families that they had been separated from for years. With the information from Mick's birth certificate, Mark was able to go through the birth records to see if he had any living relatives. His mother met his father, a sailor, and they had been married. Shortly after, she had the marriage annulled and returned home pregnant with Mick. Mark found his mom. She put Mick up for adoption because he was sick when he was born and he didn't have the money to help him. But now, finally, mother and son are reunited, thanks to the help of a kind police officer. Subscribe for more.